The psalmist said, how good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. That feels good when we have a wonderful classic prayer, classic books, classic unity. Good, good, good. All right, thank you, Claudia. Well, Moses and Jesus were playing a threesome round of golf, and Moses hit the ball, and it was rolling down the fairway toward the water hazard, and he very quickly lifted his club, his golf club, and the waters parted, and the ball rolled through to the other side. And then Jesus got up and he hit the ball, and it headed for the same water hazard, and it landed in the middle of the pond, but it just hovered there. And so Jesus walked out on the water and hit the ball on up further down the fairway. So the third guy gets up, and he's a hacker. He just whacks the ball, and it goes over the fence, but it hits a truck that's passing by, so it bounces back into the golf course and lands on the roof of a shack, and it rolls down the downspout and through the gutter to the downspout and spits itself out onto the fairway, and it's rolling for the same water hazard when it hits a rock and it pops it up onto a lily pad that's in the pond, at which time a frog jumps up and takes the ball in its mouth just as an eagle swoops down and grabs the frog. And just as the eagle is flying over the green, the frog squeals and the ball comes out of its mouth and drops right into the cup for a hole-in-one. And Moses turns to Jesus and he said, I just so don't like playing with your dad. Okay. I thought you would have got that punchline long before I actually said it. That joke is so long. All right. Doug and I have been playing golf, and so it's kind of like that, huh? So have you ever reached the end of your rope? The end of your rope, bumped up against an impossible situation with no seeming way out, and you feel that you're at the edge of all that you can do in your heart, your mind, and your capabilities, and in your consciousness, where you feel that you can't compromise anymore, you can't try any harder, you can't grow anymore. Raise your hand if you're ready to go out to recess in the school of life, if you're ready to go out to recess at those times. Certainly, we see this in the movement in our nation right now. You know, most of us who have been on the spiritual path for any length of time know that conditions that drive us forward are there to release the larger reality of truth that's trying to come forth, right? There's an infinite reality of truth, especially spiritual truth, but that the word truth is so up in our nation right now. I mean, there is a larger reality of truth that's trying to come forth that maybe could never happen without the chaos of the transformation that we're experiencing right now, with the divisiveness and with all the stuff that's happening. Sometimes problems can seem bigger when they're played out on a national level, right? But we need to remind ourselves that a principle is a principle. And just as the principle of mathematics is the same, whether you're working with big numbers or little numbers, a principle is a principle. And there is a spiritual principle of a saving grace. And it provides that out of the darkness, there will always come a solution to any problem that will evolve us to a higher level of being. If we work in cooperation with it, if we allow it. The principle is there. The principle is always there. It rests there. It remains there. It lives in the eternal oneness of the divine mind. But we have to learn to work in cooperation with it. And it's imperative that we appreciate this spiritual principle of saving grace, because God mind, the universal Christ consciousness, does not know any kind of limitation, or nothing is impossible to it. And it always works to bring forth solutions and healings and answers and whatever is needed to bring the allness and the oneness of the divine. And we can trust that now for our nation. And we can cooperate with this spiritual law of saving grace by affirming and claiming and knowing the truth that our nation is under the guidance of the Christ. Let's affirm that, put our hands on our hearts and say, our nation is under the guidance of the Christ. Together, our nation is under the guidance of the Christ. Yes, it is. It was interesting. I've been going back to some of my former sermons to use them as a rough draft kind of jumping off place for the messages I'm creating for you here. And when I went back to this message, it was from 2008. And I used the same thing about the problems going on in our nation. Only there were different problems then, right? Remember the financial crisis of the banking and all of that. So anyway, in the same way that we look at kind of the big picture of what's going on in the nation, if we find ourselves standing on the edge of an impossible situation, we can trust that it's there to drive us to a larger reality about our lives, to an expanded version in our consciousness. We are not standing at a point of devastation or loss or rejection. We are not at a point of breakdown. You will find you are standing at a point of breakthrough. And we are in part 2 now of our 3-part series, Inspired and Unstoppable, as we're looking at the divine masculine to see ways that we can use our thinking nature, the thinking aspect in consciousness, to advance our Christ consciousness. And last week we shared the story of Joseph and how he used the spiritual faculty of imagination to build a positive inner vision and a positive state of consciousness that carried him to divine right outcomes. And today we're going to look at the story of Moses at the Red Sea to discover another process for evolving our consciousness beyond any seeming barrier. So as you're listening to the lesson, if there's anything in your mind anything in your life that you're bumping up against that seems difficult to overcome, a sense of frustration, a sense of limitation or whatever it is, ask your inner self to listen so that you can expand your consciousness to move beyond whatever it is. You're familiar with the story of Moses. It's found in Exodus chapters 3 through 14. The part I'm focusing on is where Moses asks Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh says no. And so the Lord, every time you hear the word the Lord in spiritual interpretation, it means the law. Just always think Lord means law. So spiritual law. Pharaoh says no. And so spiritual law responds to Pharaoh's consciousness, to that punishing, dominating consciousness, because we create in consciousness, right? And so spirit responds by sending a series of plagues. Frogs, flies, diseased cattle, boils, locusts, and the 10th and last plague was the death of the firstborn child, which brought such distress to Egypt that Pharaoh was forced to let the Israelites go. Well, they left happily until they got out into the desert and started wandering and whining and complaining. And when they got to the Red Sea and discovered that Pharaoh's armies were charging after them, they felt doomed, and they accused Moses of leading them in the desert to die. Would that we had stayed in Egypt and had suffered there. Would have been better than to come out here and die in the desert. And so you see them whining and complaining. Moses, metaphysically or spiritually, is following the intuitive insight he received to move out of Egypt. Egypt is lower consciousness. And when he went up to high consciousness on the mountain and faced the burning bush, he got this intuition, this insight, to move to higher ground. You'll remember that Moses was born, his life is really in 3 segments, which would be a whole series of lessons. But you remember that he was drawn out of the water and raised in Pharaoh's court, and in the early years, and in the later years, he evolved into lawgiver. Moses is the lawgiver. He is the development in our consciousness that hears and receives spiritual law, a message from the Lord. He hears and receives spiritual law. And then he acts on that to draw us forward into a greater expression of life. So Moses is that part of you that gets that insight, that intuition, there's a better way, there's a higher way, and has the ability to execute, to lead you to that higher way. Are you with me? He gave the Israelites a powerful formula for overcoming any adversity when he stretched out his staff over the Red Sea and spoke those famous, famous words, a series of words that really are a formula for advancing your consciousness when you're standing at the edge of some adversity. He raised up his staff and he said, "Fear not, stand ye still, and see the salvation of Jehovah, which he will work for you this day. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord, spiritual law, will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." Powerful, powerful series of steps that we can follow in the unfolding of our consciousness. He spoke those words, the waters divided. You know, the Israelites went through on dry land. The Egyptian armies came, they moved in, the waters washed over them, and they perished. Elizabeth Sand Turner, who, by the way, came out of the church in Nashville. That was her original home church, and she wrote the 3 books on the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible. She says in her book, Let There Be Light, "There comes a time when you make your escape from living in lower consciousness." So been there. "You desire to be born into spirit, but you cannot rise out of the flesh. Something binds you down. Like a hot air balloon, you are tugging at the guy wires that hold you to earth. If you are bound by worldly phenomena, habits, diagnosis, addictions, appearances, the cords that hold you are states of consciousness which must be dissolved." So it's very powerful. There comes a time when you make your escape from living in lower consciousness. You desire to be born into the spirit, but you cannot rise out of the flesh. Something binds you down. Like a hot air balloon, you're tugging at the guy wires that hold you to earth. If you are bound by worldly phenomena, habits, diagnosis, addictions, appearances, the cords that hold you are states of consciousness which must be dissolved. So we can advance in consciousness. We're all here to grow in consciousness. So metaphysically, there's so much going on here. I want to give you a few interpretation of some of the characters and places, and then we'll look at how it relates to our lives. Pharaoh is your ruling ego, your thinking nature that's ruling from sense consciousness and dominating. And he's living in Egypt. Down in Egypt is living in lower consciousness of the sense realm. The Egyptians all live in that consciousness, so they are our lower vibration thought people. Pharaoh rules them. There's a dominating consciousness that's ruling our sense thoughts like guilt and shame and anger and procrastination and anger and regret and frustration and envy and depression. And that's ruling in it's ruling in our minds. Pharaoh commands those thoughts to follow us whenever we try to escape them. Try to step out of depression. Try to step out of addiction. Try to step out of your belief in that some cancers are incurable. And those thoughts chase you to draw you back into that ruling belief. The Red Sea is that fixed universal thought of collective consciousness. It is the idea that's been out there and solidified itself, and you now believe it, like some cancers are incurable, that the body loses its vitality as we age, that there's a glass ceiling, that all men are liars, that all women are this, or whatever it is out there in the collective consciousness, somehow you've agreed with it in you. So that's the Red Sea. To break out of that belief that is a universal consciousness can be a more difficult journey. The children of Israel, God bless those little babies, they are the aspiring thoughts in us. They're the positive thought people in us that want to move out of from darkness to light. They want to move they're the parts of us that want to get out of lower consciousness and on to the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey that now Moses has told us, just follow me and we'll get to a better place. So we find in the story a condition where our Egyptian lower thought consciousness, our lower thought people, are dominating and in conflict with our higher thoughts. what to do, right? The Metaphysical Bible Dictionary says, when we follow divine law, we build up the Christ consciousness until it becomes the leader of all of our thoughts. In our communion in the silence with the great I Am, the bondage of the higher to the lower is made clear, and the true way of release is indicated. So you go into that great I Am and you see, whoa, hold on, I've got this in reverse. The lower self of me is controlling the higher self of me. Didn't Paul say, now that I know better, I should do better, or I wish that I could do better, but I keep falling back onto the old way. So in the silence of the great I Am, it's revealed that, oops, you're living backwards. The Lord's Prayer sentence that, I can't remember it right now. Anyway, the word evil in the Lord's Prayer is the word live spelled backwards. And if there's evil in your life, you're living backwards to the truth of who you are in spirit. Deliver us from evil. Yeah. Deliver me from living backwards from my life. So the way of release, when we've let something rule in us that's become established in consciousness, it can be difficult to break out of it, especially when it's in the collective consciousness. So what happens is the Lord sends plagues. God does not punish us. God does not test us. It's spiritual law. If you're living in lower consciousness, you're creating lower consciousness experiences. And they'll continue to come around until you get up to a higher level. You'll continue to create things that plague you while you live in lower consciousness. So you want to pay attention to the plagues, when plagues come, when truths come up that make you feel uncomfortable. We all have some ideas of truth that we've accepted, that our soul is bringing up for us in these experiences for the express purpose of transforming them in our lives, right? When a plague comes, it's your soul saying, woohoo, woohoo, I have this for you. Time for an advanced class. I'm going to bring you out of recess, come into class, we're going to do some homework, and you're going to advance your consciousness. What we want to pay attention to in this experience is as you release some negativity in you or some way you've been living backwards, if it keeps coming back around like the plagues did, if it keeps coming back around, it's simply a message from the universe that you are being invited to learn something from it in this round that you had not observed before, right? So you want to look for the hidden meaning in the returning cycle so that you can expand your consciousness to end the repeating pattern. Are you with me? I'm ready to move out of lower consciousness. I'm going to step out of that. We're going to make it practical here in a moment. Where is it in my notes? Let's make it practical. If your ruling Pharaoh is anger, you're quick to fly off the handle at something, or you have jealousy, or if that's your ruling consciousness, and it's in the collective, jealousy is in the collective consciousness, and you repeatedly give way to anger, you build up that habit. You may attempt to overthrow it, to dethrone it, but you find that it continues to rule you, continues to dominate you. Maybe certain scenarios arise with your spouse where you spit out words that you regret, or you lock yourself away in an emotional chamber and you're unavailable, or you reach for some distraction rather than having the loving conversation that could maybe heal the experience, transform your consciousness. And you keep at that until a plague comes. You blow up again. You blow up. You lose it. And your spouse says, enough is enough. Enough is enough. And so out of fear of losing your spouse and the desire to live free with peace in your heart, you agree to stop. You agree to become stronger than your negative habit. But remember, Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites go 10 times. Plagues came. And each time the plague ended, Pharaoh reverted back to his selfish domination and his controlling ways. And for us, any one of us, anyone who lives in anger, as soon as the blow-up smooths over, there's a tendency to just revert back to the way it's always been. We see in the story that oftentimes plagues don't overcome sense consciousness or something that's well established in consciousness if a plague just comes one time or 2 times or 10 times before we're ready to give it up. You know, it takes frogs and flies and locusts and boils and diseased cattle before we're finally willing to say, I'm choosing another way, and I'm going to choose that way until I actually move in that way and leave this other behind. Now, many people think it takes a great amount of faith to escape Pharaoh and that ruling consciousness that's in us. But Jesus taught it differently. When the disciples said, "Master, increase our faith," he said, if you have the faith of a grain of a mustard seed, you'll say to this tree, "Be uprooted and cast into the sea," and it will obey you. And even Moses, in changing consciousness, simply raised his staff and made the declaration to shift his belief. And he gave that formula: fear not, stand still, see the salvation of Jehovah, which he will work for you this day. For the Egyptians whom you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. So I want to finish up today by just going over that formula in a little bit of detail. First word, fear not. Fear not. When you let go of fear and stand in prayer, and the last sentence, you shall hold your peace. So you fear not, stand still, and in prayer, and hold your peace, and focus on what God can do in and through and as you. When you do that, you activate a life, love, a power, and an intelligence that penetrates all of life. You put yourself in the current of spirit, and you unleash that innate force that is alive in you. And that force can requalify you. That force can requalify you. It can transmute your experience, and it can transcend any weakness or limitation in you. The Pharaoh part of you would say that's impossible, but the great I am in you says, fear not. Do not be afraid. Cease your anxious striving. Stand still, which means the way ahead is going to require you to stand firm in your resolve. It's going to require you to apply some mental and spiritual strength of mind. Stand still and see the salvation. See the opportunity. See God as the divine solution, so that you release and shift your thoughts to a higher vibration. To a higher vibration. And for the Egyptians whom you see today, the lower consciousness you've been living in, you will never see again. Because once you make that leap in consciousness, once you let that requalifying energy of the Christ transform the experience and requalify you into a higher vibrational experience, you can never go back. You can't go back to the old ways. They can't chase you anymore because you're living at a level where they can't reach you. There's a Red Sea we all bump up against, and it's the place where we become automatic, or we go unconscious, or we default to the way it's always been. We default to the behavior that we're comfortable with down in Egypt, no matter how miserable the conditions may be. We just default to that, and we choose the thing that will not expand our heart or our consciousness. We stay stuck. Our transformation is not about making ourselves wrong for this. It's about noticing when we do it, when we come up against a perceived limitation. How do you react when things get difficult? Is your initial instinct to stay down in the familiarity of Egypt, no matter how bad it is? No matter how bad it is. Because that reaction to not grow spiritually is the guardian of stagnation. Guardian of stagnation. It will keep you in the same small, limiting choices, creating the same small, limited life. So today, break down or break through. There's someone astounding in you, and it's the Christ of your being. Every journey out of Egypt to the Red Sea gives us each the opportunity to deepen the truth of who we are and to expand our consciousness. And so today I want to invite you to dare to be more your loving, audacious self. Let that self come out of you. Strengthen that spiritual muscle, Show yourself your true colors and what you're capable of. Advance yourself across the cosmic border of all that you know, right? Lift up that golf club and let that watch those waters part before you. And then lastly, take time to celebrate yourself. Do the happy dance. When you've made the shift in consciousness, you'll know it. All the tumblers click into place. And I'm not that way anymore. I'm not that anymore. You know it. It's a mindful work, yet the rewards are awesome. Fear not, stand still, see the salvation of Jehovah, which he will work for you this day. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord, spiritual law, will work for you, and you shall hold your peace. And so it is. Let's seal this for just a moment in prayer. And let these words transform you, requalify you. Let anything that's been in you be removed permanently. There's another line in Exodus that says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people that are down in Egypt and have heard their cry. And I am come to deliver them out of the land of the Egyptians. I am come to bring them up out of that land to a good land, a large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And so, loving presence, as we turn within, today we say, I am not afraid. I stand firm and see the opportunity before me. The opportunity to be more than I have ever been before, to advance on the journey of my spiritual growth. I let the wondrous law of your good work in and through me to heal and bless and enrich all that I am. And surrounded by Spirit, I am illumined by the wisdom that rises up within me. I am led by the Spirit of truth. I am made whole. I am set free. Stand still. See the salvation of Jehovah, which he will work for you this day. And so it is. Amen.